Well, hey everybody, it's Travels with Dottie coming to you from beautiful Eagle Nest Lake in northern New Mexico. And it's the middle of August 2024. It's actually August 13th to be exact. And here I'm going to talk to you about boondocking, being in the desert in Quartzsite. And this is for people that really maybe not very experienced doing this. Maybe you're thinking about coming out to Quartzsite with your RV for the first time. And maybe you're not all that prepared and you don't know that much about it. I was in that category when I first got my, my first trailer. I really didn't understand the electrical systems and why I knew I had a battery, so why couldn't I just plug stuff in and have it work? And it really doesn't work that way. So we're going to slow things down a little bit because of these 10 things, 6 of them have to do with power. If you're coming out to Quartzsite and you decided, I'm not going to stay in an RV park, there are 50 of them in Quartzsite, so there's plenty of options. But what you want to do is you want to be out with most of the people actually in the desert in one of the Bureau of Land Management areas. And I have another video that talks about that in detail. I'll put my Quartzsite videos at the end of this so you can click on that. I'm not going to talk about those details today. I'm going to talk about what practical things and the tough things that you may face if you're not prepared, if you want to just camp in the desert. And we're talking about the winter in the desert here in Quartzsite, Arizona. Not here, but there in Quartzsite, Arizona, and say from mid-November until the end of February. That's kind of the time period. And that's important because what the weather is like is going to have a big impact on the kinds of issues that you face. So like I said, we're going to slow it down a little bit, and I want to talk about electricity in as simple a terms as I possibly can. When you are not hooked up, meaning you're not plugged into a power source, and if you got let's say you got a brand new RV, and most of them come with one battery, and most often, it's what they call a lead acid or gel battery, just a regular old battery that's not very expensive at all. And that will run the things in your trailer or RV that are what they call DC powered. In other words, where you normally plug things in your home, that's AC power, and that's 120. They call it 120 volts, sometimes 115 volt, but generally 120 volts. And DC stuff is 12 volts. And in your trailer, things like the lighting will be 12 volt. You might have USB outlets where you can plug things, like plug your phone into that. That'll be 12 volts. Your onboard furnace, it's a propane furnace, but the fan is electrical, and that'll be powered through 12 volts. And I'm not going to go, there are a few other things that are 12 volt powered, like there could be a smoke alarm, there's usually a propane and maybe even a carbon monoxide alarm. Those are all 12 volt powered. Now there are outlets, regular 120 volt outlets you could plug anything into, but you have to have a separate power source for that. And generally a new RV that you buy isn't going to have that unless you plug into what they call shore power, is which you plug your whole RV into an electrical outlet when you're in a RV park. So what we're talking about is not an RV park. So what do? There's nothing to plug into. Well, the first option, and the one I'm going to talk about most of the time, is solar power. That's what most people use that are boondocking out in the desert. And you've all heard of solar panels, so that's one component of it. You're harvesting the rays of the sun, and they're converting the rays of the sun to electricity. And I wish it was as simple as just running a wire from your solar panel to your battery to charge it. But it's not that simple. There's a device called a charge controller, which is able to take that raw power and turn it into something that the batteries can accept. And sometimes you could buy a solar panel that has one of those built in. Some RVs, the newer ones, may have that built into the RV, but you need to make sure that you have that. And from there, it feeds that power to charge a depleted battery. Sounds good, right? So then that battery, which delivers that DC power to the things that I mentioned, how do you get power into 120 volt? Well, you need another device. It's called an inverter. It takes 12 volt power out of your battery, right? And it converts it into 120 volts. And the simplest thing you can do is you can just run like a power strip off that inverter and plug things into that. Or there are ways you can just plug in your whole RV into it, like you're plugging into shore power at an RV park. And that, I'm not going to get into the details of that. Usually it's going to require an adapter and everything. But now that you understand how that might happen, and most people that are comfortable out there have batteries, they have solar panels, they have an inverter, and they're able to plug things in like their TV and their microwave and most stuff that you can think of that you might want to use when you're camping. So I'm going to try something a little different here in describing how this works and what you need to understand in order to make it work for you. It can get very confusing. When we talk about batteries and appliances, they talk about amps and watts and voltages, and it can get very, very confusing. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to look at a battery, or if you can have more than one battery. We're going to look at that as a bank, right? And the power in that bank represent your deposits. Understand that instead of dollars, we're going to be storing watts. Now, you're going to get a little confused here because if you go to buy a battery, it's going to say this is a 100 amp hour battery. Well, Rob just said watts. What the hell? Well, understand this. I wish this wasn't the case, but in order to understand this stuff, you're going to have to do some basic math conversion. And 1 amp is equal to 12 watts. So if I have a battery, and most batteries that we're going to talk to have a capacity or deposits in there of 100 amp hours, and we're going to convert that to watts because we want to have this whole conversation in watts. So what is 100 times 12? It's 1200. So that 100 amp hour battery, we're going to stop saying amps about it, and we're going to call it, I have 1200 watts deposited in my bank. All right? And I am going to use those deposits to power things in my RV that I want to power. Well, how do I figure out how much I need? Well, just about every appliance is going to have like a sticker on it, or you'll have access to information online if you buy something that will tell you the running watts of your appliance. Let's talk about a big one, like my microwave. A little is going to depend on the settings, but for argument's purposes, it's about 1800 watts. And you might say, well, I'm in big trouble if I have one battery and it's only 1200 watts and this thing's 1800 watts, it's not enough. Well, you got to do more math, I'm sorry. But you have to in order to really understand this. When an appliance is rated at a number of watts, it's really watt hours. It's the number of watts this appliance would use in an hour. So if you ran your microwave for an hour, it would use 1800 watts. Who runs their microwave for an hour? Maybe someone, but not me, and probably not you. The average amount of time that I run my microwave is just a few minutes. So you would take that, and I wrote this stuff down, so I didn't have to remember it. Let's see. 1,800 watts divided by 60 minutes is 30 watts per minute. And if I run it for 5 minutes, it's 150 watts. That's a much smaller chunk of that battery, isn't it? So it's an 1,800 watt appliance, but I divide it by 60 minutes. I get 30 watts per minute, and I go, this is how many minutes I'm going to run it. Okay? So that's how much I'm going to be withdrawing from my bank, my battery bank, and my deposits in that bank when it's 100% full is 1,200 watts. All right. So with those basics in mind, I'm going to kind of go over this a little bit more in many of these 6 things that involve power. So the first thing I want to talk about is the weather. You're going to think, well, I'm going to the desert. I'll worry about being hot. Well, if you're going to Quartzsite between the end of November and the end of February, you're not going to be worried about getting hot. You're going to be worried about getting cold, especially at night. The number one thing that ruins someone's time in the desert for a newcomer that I've seen is being so cold you can't sleep. You could be miserable. But you say, hey, I've got my battery that came with mine. My furnace runs on propane. What's the problem? Okay, here is the problem. Yes, your onboard furnace runs on propane, but to circulate that hot air, a fan runs, and the fan uses about 7.5 amps of power, depending on how cold it is, at least 50% of the time. If it's really cold, maybe 80% of the time. So let's do our little math on that. Remember, it's 12 watts for every amp, so 12 times 7.5. It's going to use 90 watts. And say it's cold and it's night for 10 hours, that's 900 watts. Now, it depends on how often that fan kicks on and off, but you can tell that's a lot of power. What happens to many people is they flip that furnace on, it gets nice and toasty, they go to bed, and they wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning with their teeth chattering. None of the lights are working, the heat's not working, nothing's working, because they've depleted that battery. Right? And I'm going to talk about types of batteries at the end in capacities, because I'm sorry that it gets more complicated, but your bank, the amount of watts you have to spend, can be very different depending on the type of battery that you have. Okay, so what do I do about that? I don't run my onboard furnace. I think it's highly inefficient. What I do is I have a propane heater. It's made by Empire that hangs on the wall. It's attached to a 20-pound propane tank with a long cord, and I vent my trailer a little bit, and it runs without a fan, without electricity, and it's got a little thermostat on it. It keeps me toasty all night. That 20-pound tank, depending on how cold it gets, over it could last 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks on 1 pound or on a 20-pound propane tank, which costs about $15 or $16 to fill, depending on the price of propane. So that's pretty cheap, and I'm not using any electricity to keep myself warm and toasty. There are other types of non-electric propane heat sources. Research them well. And the other thing, if you're really strapped for cash, is lots of blankets, or better yet, a sleeping bag that's rated for like less than 32 degrees. They're 0-degree bags. You will be nice and toasty, even that everything inside your rig is cold. You'll be nice and toasty if you have enough blankets, and maybe wool blankets, or you have a nice toasty, spend a little bit of money on a good sleeping bag, not a cheap one. Okay, that's number one. Number two is electricity. Again, when you're just sitting in your RV and you don't turn anything in particular on, there's what they call a base or a parasitic draw. There are certain things in your RV that are using electricity no matter what you're doing, like the various alarms, like the propane alarm, the carbon monoxide alarm, the smoke alarm, the displays on certain things, and if you turn on any of your lights. But it's 12 to 48 watts, or that could be anywhere from 288 to 1100 watts per day. And you know, if you have a small RV, we're towards the 288. If you have a big Class A with lots of gadgets, that could get you the 152 watts per day, right? If you have one of those inverters that invert that 12 volt to 120 volt, and you have that turned on all day and all night, just having that inverter running has an overhead, and it could be almost 500 watts in a day just to have the inverter turned on with nothing running. So keep that in mind. And at the end, again, we're going to be talking about batteries and how much capacity you really need and what kind of batteries you really need. Internet is a sore subject in Quartzsite. Most people rely on either their phones to do a hotspot for internet, or they have devices that use cellular service. And that, most of the time, if there's a strong cell signal, that works just fine. And you really don't need a lot of power for it, because you can have these little hotspot routers that are separate from the phone that use DC power. You plug it into a USB, you're good. Not a big power hog. And then what happens? Here's what might happen to you if you get, in December, you get to Quartzsite and you get to your site and you go, wow, I've got like 5 bars. This is great. I'm going to stream everything. I'm going to be, and you try to stream something and it doesn't work, and you run a speed test and it's barely doing. What's going on? I have 5 bars. Well, Quartzsite has a population of about 2,400 permanent residents. And if you're there in December, you're there with the 1 million people that visit every winter, and everyone is competing for those few cell towers. And even though you've got a good signal, there's not data capacity. So people get very, very frustrated that they can't even send an email, much less stream their favorite TV shows. What I have found is that of all, I've been several years, and of all the cellular services, I've had T-Mobile in the Quartzsite, I've had AT&T, and I've had Verizon. And the only one that's worked for me, now this is in La Posa South, you can be in lots of different areas, but this is in La Posa South. AT&T is the only one that's been consistently good for me. Beside that, I have Starlink, and I know you've probably heard a lot about Starlink. It's very expensive. It's $150 a month. It's $600 for the equipment. But when I run my Starlink, which I have now, this would be the 3rd year I've had it in Quartzsite, I don't need to worry about internet. It's just fine. But big drawback, again, we're going to talk about power for Starlink. Well, I said the hotspot, that doesn't use anything, hardly at all. But Starlink, you got to plug in, it's 120 volts, and it can use up to 150 amps for a 24-hour period if you leave it on. Now you can turn it off overnight, but if you leave it on, it's gonna cook 150 amps, or what's 150 amps times 12? Right, we want to do everything in watts, and 150 times 12, that's 1,800 watts in 24 hours just for your internet. And you already noticed, if I have that one battery that's only 1,200 watts, Starlink ain't gonna go for 24 hours. So, let's go on to the next one. Hair dryers, microwaves, things like that. We've talked about this a little bit. Hair dryers and microwaves, air fryer, instant pots, induction take big amounts of power. And remember, take what it's rated for. Like I gave you the example on the microwave, 1,800 watts on average, divided by 60, It's 30 watts per minute, and how many minutes you're going to be using it. That's how much you're going to have to withdraw from the bank. The other thing, not power related, but comfort related, is it gets windy. It can get windy as heck with gusts up to 70 miles per hour in the desert. And generally we'll have a windstorm come in, you'll have a little bit of notice, but it will last all day, sometimes a couple of days. And it's not comfortable going outside. You'll either be trapped in your RV or you'll get in your car and you'll go into town and do things. Number 6, now if you're staying in one of the LTVAs, the long-term visitor areas, they have dump stations to dump your gray and black tank. And with the fee that you pay, either $40 for 2 weeks or $180 for the whole season, you can use that dump station. If you're not in one of these areas and you're in one of the free areas, you can pay in town. I don't know how much it is. It's not much to dump your tanks. But and when it's busy, even in town where you pay, you can wait in line for a while. Now, that's especially true if you're in the LTVA and you're going to La Posa South to the big dump stations down there. In busy season, you can wait easily up to an hour to dump your tanks, and just expect that. Don't let it be a surprise. Also, speaking of waiting, during December and January when it's really busy in Quartzsite, if you want to go out to eat, you want to go to the grocery store, it's going to be crowded and you can have very long waits in popular restaurants, and just expect that. Also, there can traffic jams. It can be messy, and finding places to park can be really challenging, and you have to sometimes walk long distances from where you park to where you want to hang out and see stuff, especially in Tyson Wells, where like sort of the flea market area is and the big tent is that happens every January. So expect that. The number 8, you can I've had up to 5 days in a row of total cloud cover and rain where I wasn't getting any solar power. So the solar power is like making deposits into your battery bank, right? You show up in Quartzsite with a 1200 watt battery all full and you start using stuff and making withdrawals from that battery. Especially overnight where there's nothing coming in, you have to use the sun during the day to make deposits to replenish what you used, right? But if there's no sun, if it's rainy, it's not going to be useful. So be prepared for that too. So what does that mean? To get through those cloudy days, you either need a big battery bank, more than one, and we'll talk about this in detail at the end, or you need a generator, right? And generator and you want to get one that's an inverter generator, not a construction, not an open frame generator, those are super loud and you'll be really disturbing your neighbors and you won't be popular. You get an inverter generator that has a pure sine wave output, anywhere from $400 to $1,000, depending on the quality, and there's a broad range. But you can use a generator to put deposits in the battery just like solar. I have a generator. So I have a generator, I have a lot of solar, I have a big battery bank, I have it all. Number 10, you decide you're going to be there for a long time. You're going to miss Amazon? Do you want to be able to access it, get packages? Well, you need to be smart about it, because Amazon usually uses UPS. And general delivery at the post office, they're not going to take it. They're going to reject it. You're not going to get general deliveries from Amazon unless you happen to get lucky and they use USPS delivery. Then it'll come to general delivery, and you might have to wait a long time in line at the post office to even pick it up. There are mail services that you can sign up for and need to pay for. Like mine is Moon Mountain Mail. It was a new business last year. They did a stellar job, and I think I pay something like $80 a year. And they take FedEx, UPS, and USPS. And there's a couple of other package services in town that do the same thing. Now, I believe at least don't make this mistake, because you can not sign up and pay Moon Mountain Mail. You can have packages delivered there anyway and pay like $5 a package, but that will not work if it's post office. It's complicated, but the only way it'll work for post office is you sign up for the service, pay them, and you have to fill out post office forms to be put on file so they can legally take USPS packages. And that's important because when I order from Amazon, I can't tell them how to ship it. When it ships, that's when I find out. So that can be a little complicated. So those are the 10 things, but let's talk about batteries. Many of you have probably heard this. The newest thing in the past few years are lithium batteries. Chances are, if you buy a new RV and it's not a real fancy one, you're going to get one battery. It's probably going to, like if it's a bumper pull trailer, it's going to be in a little plastic case, one battery, and it's going to be not lithium, it's going to be what they call lead acid or gel battery. At any rate, those kinds of batteries, they say, hey, it's a 100 amp hour battery, which remember, 100 amp hours, doing the math times 12 is 1200 watts, so it's got 1200 watts. But that kind of battery, you can only use half of it. If you go below the 50% mark, you do damage to the battery over a pretty short period of time, and then you have to buy a new one. So for all intents and purposes, a 1200 watt battery is only going to give you effectively half that, or 600. If you buy a lithium battery, you can use pretty much the whole thing. You can take it down to zero. You don't ever want to do that. And there are people that argue online that taking it to zero can harm the long-term health of the lithium battery, but you can certainly take it well below 50%. I've done it many, many times. So it's higher capacity, okay? It's more efficient. It has more longer life than the lead acid battery. So that would involve you spending some money to replace that original lead acid battery with a lithium. And that used to be a real problem. When I first started in 2020, I bought my first lithium battery, and it was $1,000 for 100 amp hours, or do the math, 1200 watts. From Battle-Born Batteries, it was expensive. Well, that's changed. There are, I'm going to put up on the screen here, right over here, here's some very inexpensive ones that are listed on Amazon. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out and buy the cheapest one there. I don't know anything about it. But if you want to find out about it, there's a YouTube channel that I recommend. This guy's name is Will Prowse, and here he is up here, and I'll put a link in the description to him. He is a expert on these systems and these batteries. And one of the things that he does, he takes a lot of these batteries that are for sale and he tears them apart, and he does a professional analysis of the quality of the battery. And just about any battery that you buy that you see is cheap, make sure that Will has done a video on that. Watch the video, make sure that it's okay. But you want to do, it's called LP04 batteries. That's a particular type of lithium battery. And you can see instead of $1,000, there's a bunch under $200. And you can maybe afford to buy more than one, which I suggest that you do. Because let's talk about solar for a minute. Now, if you had one lithium battery that was 100 amp hours, or doing our little math at 12 times 100, 1200 watts, to fill that battery, you might be recommended that you have a 200 watt solar panel. I said, well, that should work because 200 watts will get me 200 watts of power. Well, it won't. Let me pull up my math here. I think I have this at the beginning. All right. A 200 watt solar panel, because it's in the winter and there's only X amount, the sun's low in the sky, so it's not optimal. You've got the short number of daylight hours in the winter. A 200 watt on a good sunny day all day will get you 600 watts out of that. It'll be depositing 600 watts in that. Remember that one battery, you had 1200 watts in it, it'll feed 600 into it. And that's it on a good day. A 200 watt panel will get you about 600 watts on a good day. So what does that mean? You have, on your first day, you have 1200 because you showed up with a full battery, you use it, you get another 600, so that's, you can see if you use more than that, your battery is going to deplete over time. You can add a little bit more solar and put more in, or occasionally you can buy that generator and hook up that generator, or you can, there are going to be some nights where, or sometimes where you don't have to use much power. So here's what's best. Buy as much solar and as many batteries as you have room for, right? You have room for as much solar and as much solar panel as you can afford and have room for. And let me tell you this, if you don't know what you're doing, do not install your own solar system. You could cause a fire. You could lose not only your RV, you could potentially lose your life if you create a fire hazard. There are two ways around this. One is to hire someone. There's two great places in town. There's Solar Bills and Discount Solar. They have experts that can put in even a very simple, inexpensive system for you. And either place will let you buy your own components. They'll charge you the labor. And that's a safe thing to do. Now, in my case, I had a friend that I absolutely 100% trusted, knew what he was doing, and he helped me build my system. If you don't want to do either one of these things, there are self-contained things, they call them solar generators. And I'll just put an example of one right here where all you have to do is plug your stuff into that, plug your solar panel into that, and that will be it for you. You don't have to install anything. You're plugging a solar panel. Everything's built in. That thing I told you about, the charge controller, that in the beginning, that translates the sun into stuff that the battery can charge, and then you need the inverter to change what the battery has into 120 volt. That's all built into this unit. These, the bigger they are, the more expensive they are. So there's lots of options there. You don't have to worry about installation because there's really no installation required. If you have questions, put them in the comments. I can do my best to answer them or refer you to websites or people that I think that can answer the questions better. And if you're not a newbie and you're an expert, and I've said anything on here that you think or know to be wrong, do it politely, but please put it in the comment. And if I said something really egregious, I'll probably take down the video and redo it. So I welcome feedback, as long as it's polite, please. But I'm open to constructive criticism about if I've misstated something or misled you, or even wasn't very clear. And I hope this analogy of looking at your battery, and I hope I did mention you can buy more than one battery, and there are ways to chain them together. So, or instead of buying a 100 amp hour battery, you can buy a 200 or a 300 or a 400. They come in various sizes. You just need room to put them in. There are lots of options out there. But I hope the analogy of looking at that battery as like a bank and a watt hour is like $1. And when you use electrical thing, it's like making withdrawals. And when you use a solar panel with the sun, or you use a generator, you're making deposits. So I hope that all makes sense to you. And I hope someone out there got something out of this video. I appreciate you watching it, and I hope I helped somebody.